Peter, thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very generous, Father. And so my work, as Father just said, is in schools with children, adolescents, teenagers. My background is in great books, classical, Socratic programs, up until this point, actually, at charter schools, primarily. So I've opened 2 schools, K-5. I've opened a 6-12. And now I'm opening the St. Jerome Institute, which is a Catholic school, independent, so it's not archdiocesan, but within the Catholic tradition, serving grades 9 through 12. So having said all of that, just as a caveat, I really am focusing quite a bit on the project that I'm most focused on in my work. And so it may seem odd at parts, and it may not seem particularly relevant to the Lenten spirit, but I think that it is, and I'll try to trace some connections to that as we go along. I never wanted to be a teacher. I never wanted to have anything to do with education. My dad's a teacher. His mom was a teacher. And I swore I'd never do that. I wanted to do something active. I wanted to be a soldier. I wanted to be in the trenches somehow, making a difference. Anything but be a teacher. And but I really got pulled into it and fell in love with it. And one of the reasons for that is that I saw teaching in a particular way as being a response, and in some ways the only adequate response to a deep cultural problem that I see in our society today. So there are lots of aspects to the cultural problem that I just referred to, and we could trace those out at great length. But I just want to center in on one aspect of it, perhaps the most essential aspect of it. But before we do that, before we talk about what that cultural problem is and how it relates to teenagers or to young people, I just want to point out some of the symptoms. So when you think about teenagers today, or you look at teenagers, you consider teenagers, I don't think that you see very much joy. I think it's very rare to see teenagers play. And I think that when we think about teenagers, we usually imagine that they're speaking in a sarcastic or cynical way. And I think we assume that this is part of that age. And I think that's a lie. I don't think that's true. I think that's something that we've told ourselves in the face of a very serious sickness, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual sickness that is affecting our young people today. So stepping back from that, and I'll warn you that my background is in philosophy, so there's going to be a little philosophizing here. Forgive me. There's a big debate in the 20th century philosophically. It's really an ancient debate, but it comes up in a new form in the 20th century, and that's between, let's just say, using rough terms, the realists, right, and what you might call the structuralists, heirs to the nominalists. And the two sides of this debate, again, very roughly speaking, are on the one hand, a group of people who want to say that there is a reality, an objective reality, and we can come to know it, and we can come to engage it, and often that it's evident that we can depend on it, right? And the other side, the structuralist, wants to say, well, everything in the world as we know it today is just convention. It's just made up. Now, as Catholics, I think we are inherently realists. We believe that there is a reality, we believe that there is an objective reality, and we're very critical of this idea that things don't have an essence, that they don't have a nature, and that they're just convention. And that's all true. But I think there's a real risk in underestimating structuralism, because there's some truth to it. And the truth is that humans have a tremendous power. And it can be a good power, but it can also be a dark power. And it's a power to create, to make, to smith, to build, to craft, and to build a culture within the world. And when this power is used in a holy and righteous way, it is in conformity with reality and ultimately in conformity with God. But there's a dark side to it, and that is, it's quite possible, I think we see evidence of this historically, and I think we see very discrete evidence of this in our time, for man to create, to craft a culture and a way of looking at the world which is antithetical to reality, and is so powerful and is so overwhelming that it almost entirely eclipses and obfuscates reality. Now, I'm not saying it closes reality off and that we can't, perceive what is true, what is real, that we can't get to God, but I think it's very dangerous and very clear that, especially in the society that we live in today, that so much of our culture, and so much of what our culture is based on, has really created impediments to us having a direct engagement with reality and with Christ. And I think it's not just what we see out there in society, the billboards and the TV and the computers. I think it's all there. It's in the world around us, but it's also built into us, because I think it's built into our language. And to the extent that it's built into our language, it's in our thoughts, because of course thoughts are composed of language. And I think it's in our hearts, because our hearts have been trained towards the wrong objects of love and affection. And so this is a really heavy weight that I think we bear as persons. I think it's heavier than we know as we live in this particular world. And again, of course, we live in a fallen world, and so this has always been the case to some extent or another. But I would argue that it is especially the case today, and that the power of man to create, let's call it even a matrix, is more powerful than it ever has been before. So as I said before, my work is primarily with children and with teenagers. And I think that it's really important to think about this risk as we're thinking about teenagers, because in my belief, teenagers are the most vulnerable type of person. So in all of life, that entire journey from birth to death, I think that teenagers are the most vulnerable of people. And so, for instance, I think they're much more vulnerable than 5-year-olds. So if you meet a 5-year-old, right, 5-year-olds are actually very strong. If they're healthy, they're ferocious a little bit, they're gutsy, and they see right and wrong easily. This is why they love fairy tales, because these are stories about right and wrong, and they ring true to the child, the young child. But to a teenager, they're in a new place, and they're in a vulnerable place because they've got one foot in childhood. But they've got another foot sort of stepping out then towards, hopefully, adulthood. And they're asking the great question, the great human question, and the question that makes us vulnerable, and that is, who am I? And what is my destiny? What is calling my name? Who am I? Now, of course, the answer rests in Christ. But this question of identity is perhaps the question that is undergoing the most violence in our world today. And this is this question of identity is undergoing violence on multiple levels. So, one obvious example is just in the area of commodities. So you think about any of the advertisements you see on computers, websites, TVs, radio, 90% of the time, the leverage that is being used, the emotional leverage that's being used in these commercials is one of identity. Who do you want to be? You want to be like this beautiful woman. You want to be like this man. You want to be like this group of people. Buy this product. Right? Again and again and again. And it's brilliant, right? It's brilliant marketing, because we all deeply want to belong. And we all deeply want to be beautiful, to be loved, to belong to a group, to be part of a community. And so it's a really powerful way to convince us to buy things. But of course, a lot of this is directed at teenagers. And so teenagers are constantly being bombarded by these cheap answers to the great question that they're asking, who am I and what is my destiny? And then, of course, there's something deeper going on, too, beyond just the selling of commodities. And that is that there is a tremendous lie that our job today, the job of teenagers, is to create their own identity. So we don't find ourselves, we don't receive ourselves as a gift somehow from God, but that we have this responsibility to create ourselves, and we can create any self we want to. As if our identity was a fashion accessory, which means that our identity then is arbitrary. It doesn't really matter. And then, of course, if it doesn't really matter, that's the death of purpose in our lives, the death of meaning. And so, as our young people are asking this question most explicitly, most vulnerably, and being bombarded in society with all these cheap replacements to the question that are blocking their ability to see deeper sources, deeper reservoirs of meaning in their life. And then they're being given a way of thinking about identity that, you can be whatever you want to be, and you can create that, and it's really just accidental. They're becoming nihilists, of course, because there is no deeper purpose. There is no deeper meaning. And so what we're thinking, as I said before, that their sarcasm and their cynicism is just a part of their age, it's because they think they see life for the game it is. That there isn't a deeper meaning. There isn't a deeper purpose. That's just a lie that people tell to get them to do things. And so they know nothing really matters. So they're deflated. I think it's really strange that we think of young people as being sarcastic and cynical and kind of jaded when, traditionally, if you look at literature or historically, if you look at politics, the way that young people, teenagers were thought of is that they were most passionate, that they were most in love, most idealistic, most thematic, filled with spirit, and nothing could be further from the truth today. So it's interesting, in the last year, this study came out, and teenagers are having sex at the lowest rate since, I think, the 50s. Now, a lot of people who are coming from, similar places as me are applauding that. They're thinking that that's great. And there is something good to it, perhaps. But I think there's something frightening about it. Because I don't think that young people are not having sex because they become moral. Right? Or because they think there's a deeper purpose that means that they should reserve themselves for something that's truly sacred and life-giving. I think it's because they lack any passion. They lack even the drive to make love. And that should terrify us. So, if this is true, if this is an issue, how can we respond to this problem? And again, I'm painting a pretty dark picture here. I'm saying that it's in the language that we use. The television sets, it's everywhere, bombarding us all the time. It's even within us somehow. How do we respond to that? Well, I think that we have reason to be filled with a great deal of hope. And the reason that we can be filled with hope is that even through the very thickest of veils, I think our nature can't help but try to push through. And of course, grace can't help. Well, can't help, I suppose. But it comes and it lifts us. It lifts us up. And so I wanted to read a passage. I'm a humanities teacher, so you have to listen to me quote things tonight. From Dante, from the Paradiso. And I think it's a beautiful account of the nature of things and the nature of man. So, the poet says, "All things created have an order in themselves, and this begets the form that lets the universe resemble God. Here the higher creatures see the imprint of the eternal work, the end for which that pattern was itself set forth. In that order, all natures have their bent, according to their different destinies, whether nearer to their source or farther from it. They move, therefore, toward different harbors upon the vastness of the sea of being, each imbued with an instinct that impels it on its course. So there's something within our nature that draws us forth across the vast sea of life and being. And I think this should recall for us the words of Augustine, right, at the beginning of the Confessions. There's this longing, this thirst, ultimately for Christ, our final harbor, we hope. And I think what this great desire within us, this craving within us, ultimately for God, but for good things, things that will fulfill us, poses then the question, how can we wipe away this false topography that has been superimposed upon the landscape of reality? So there's this illusion that I think has been put across the topography of reality. How can we push away that mist and see the landscape of reality so that our teenagers, our young people, and us as adults can hunger and thirst for God in a pure and direct and purposeful way? Well, I think that Lent, here's my timing, I think that Lent is a perfect season to think about this, because I think that the answer is fasting. And certainly fasting in the sense of fasting on behalf of, for the intentions of our culture, the world in which we live, for the young people that are within the world. But I think there's another kind of fasting, a cultural fasting, that needs to occur in order for us to really begin to see reality. So at the school I was at last, we had a rule, and it was very controversial, and people thought we were very strange for having this rule. But it was that the students throughout the day could not make any references to pop culture. Now, the claim wasn't that pop culture is evil. It wasn't that their movies or the music that they liked or anything like that was wrong or evil. And we trusted that parents would form their children's pop culture taste. But that school was not the place for any of that white noise. That here we were going to focus on our studies and on our friendships. And likewise, we had a uniform. And so there was this singularity of identity, which again allowed that freedom of focus on the best things, the highest things that we were trying to give our students in their classrooms. Well, this is a kind of fasting. A way of taking, good things, some of them are good things, and bracketing them, putting them to the side, and looking for this simplicity, this purity, which will allow us then to listen and not have our hearing be blocked by the white noise of the world that's trying to fill us up, but instead to actually hear the quiet voice of God. So we need to fast, I think, and teenagers need to be asked to fast from the cheap fillers that are giving them a false sense of satisfaction. And again, this opens up, I think, a space of freedom for them, a freedom to actually pursue what they are truly longing for at a deeper level. So how do you do this, then? I mean, so you can have a rule like that where you somehow restrict their pop culture experience, but of course what you're doing then is you're creating a little bit of a vacuum, and that's good. It's good. Again, they can hear, they can listen for the voice of God, but you have to give them something more than that. You have to give them a structure, a way of moving forward. And I think the first place that you start is in their habits. I think the first thing that young people need is to be given habits. By habits, I mean ways of being that are regular, right? A rhythm and a way of being and a set of manners that the students have. So Augustine describes the soul as it is within our fallen nature as being knotted and being tangled. And I think the teacher or the parent is one who, with the grace of God, needs to help straighten the fibers of the young tree that is in their care, that is the child. So I can tell you as a young student, young college student, one of the most powerful influences on me was Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in which he talks about virtue as being a habit, right? And so the way that we become more excellent, the way that we become virtuous, most truly human, is through excellent habits. Habits of excellence. And the idea that habits, that is, actions of excellence, actually create grooves, formations in our soul, as though we were sculpting our souls. That was a really powerful idea to me. And it made me feel as if, gave me the sense that that my actions mattered. It just didn't matter in an abstract way, but the actions that I committed and the regular actions that I committed had an effect on my soul. That my soul was influenced by those actions. And in fact, so this is kind of comical perhaps, but something that really troubled me as a young man was thinking about, well, I want to have the virtue of courage. But it's really hard to practice courage. Like, what can I do that's courageous? And of course, there are all sorts of small things that you can do to be courageous, of course. But I wanted to do something more dramatic than that. And so my daughters can tell you that I conducted cold water dowsing, in which I would just pour cold water over my head, because it took quite a bit of courage to do that. So it's a little comical, if you can imagine. But practicing ways of being courageous, practicing ways of being excellent, practicing ways of doing noble action, because we become what we do. And we need to demand that what our young do, that their actions and their habits are excellent, and that we're crafting their souls, helping them craft their souls. But you have to have more than this too. That's the beginning. That's the foundation. And I think you need to then bring them into what I would call a sense of wonder, a poetic scent, a poetic engagement with the world. So poetry for young people is really something that is dead. They rarely have that vivid poetic experience of the world that fills them with a sense of wonder. And, again, thinking about the young person, the soul as being a tree, it has to be nourished. It has to be nourished by the dirt, the earth that it is planted within. And I think, again, as we're removing sort of the false soil, the cheap soil, the nutritionally weak soil from around their roots, we have to replace it with something. And so, this word culture, which comes from Cicero, coined by Cicero, and it was taken from the agricultural. It's taken from the agricultural word to cultivate, right? So it's really culture that gives this experience, this poetic experience, and this enrichment to the young. So we need to surround them with a community. We need to surround them with models and relationships that really exemplify the life and the vivid engagement of life that we want for our young people. And we need to help them experience the best and the highest things. This is actually the reason why we came into the Ordinariate, my family. So, my concern always was with my children that they would not encounter the Eucharist in beauty. I was always really concerned about that they wouldn't have that association of beauty with the Eucharist. I was not ever that, many of my friends were very particular about the liturgy, and I didn't know enough to be that particular about the liturgy. But what I knew was I wanted my children to experience something beautiful, because I wanted that to be clear to them, that when they went into church, that was something that belonged to God, and beauty is that expression. So I think we have to help our young, and we ourselves are called to look at the world anew as a sacramental experience. The world is a sacramental experience, and so I think that this is expressed really well in a lot of Hopkins poetry. So I'm going to read a poem to you, which is probably familiar, Pied Beauty. And I think this expresses the way that we would want our culture and we would want our young people to experience the world. So the poet writes, "Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire cold, chestnut falls, finch's wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plough. And all trades their gear and tackle trim, all things counter, original, spare, and strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, and who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. I love this poem because it's an expression of the simplest of things, and even things that are often thought of as imperfect, speaking the name of God, calling us into a deeper relationship with Christ, the divine, and the highest things. And I think that's how we want our young to experience the world, in that poetic sense. And I think we want to make sure, especially that when they're engaged in acts of service, these good habits that we were talking about before, for instance, that they are brought into a deeper thematic, poetic meaning. So, for instance, I think something that we would like to do at the St. Jerome Institute, I think something that will be powerful, is, so service projects are often a problem at a school. You treat service projects as though, it's just something you have to do. So you go out and you buy a bunch of condensed milk for people in Haiti and you put it in a box and you send it out and check, you did the service project. And, that's great. And, I think that's wonderful. There's a need there. But I think when you're wondering about how are we forming the children who are doing a service, I think we have to strive to do something more personal for them. And so, I think I envision, a Lenten practice, for instance, at the St. Jerome Institute, in which the students, during their art history class, meditating on icons of Christ, so Russian icons of Christ, for instance, thinking deeply about the symbolism of those icons, and then being led in a very specific way to go and face-to-face serve the homeless, being asked to recognize Christ in the faces of those who they are serving in need. Right? So bringing that poetic and deeper experience, true experience of the world to life for them in a deep and passionate way that should fill them with a sense of wonder and awe, the majesty of the world, even in the face of very simple things, like a beetle or a stone or another person. That God rings out in these little things, these small things that are so easy for us to take for granted. And then finally, I think, especially as we imagine our children or our students graduating or going out into the world, we have to recognize that we don't have complete power over them. And that no matter what formation we give them, what good things we expose them to, whatever habits they've acquired, that's not going to keep them from making mistakes. And they will make mistakes. And they'll go through dark times. And they'll go through tumultuous periods in their lives, stormy seas. But there is a gift that we can give them. And that is we can bequeath them with good and sacred memories. So there's a long tradition in the Western canon regarding the particular power of memory. And you'll see this in Plato, of course. He believes that all knowledge is in a sense some kind of memory or recollection. But we see it also in Augustine, right? He spends a great deal of time meditating on memory and the power of memory. So how do we bequeath these good memories? What is the power of good memories in young people? So if anybody's a Dostoevsky fan in the room, and they've read through the Brothers Karamazov, then they probably recall one of the final passages in that book, in which Alyosha, who's the protagonist of the book, he, with a group of boys, is saying to them, look, we're about to go out into the world, and we'll have many struggles, and there will be many woes. But I think that our good memories of our friendships and the good things that we have experienced here will have a redemptive effect upon us. So there's something redemptive about memory. And again, so if our children can look back and remember the beauty of the Mass, or they can remember the power of giving to others, seeing Christ in others, and the memory of that grace, then I think that can be a lighthouse to them. It can call them back, even in the most dark and troubled times that they will go through. So I have just a final story that I think, again, even though I would say, I don't think cynically, we live in very dark times, and we live in nihilistic times. I have a final story. It's a story of history, somewhat known, about the power of goodness, a good experience, or a good memory, and how that can vanquish the nihilistic spirit. So, of course, when we think of the nihilistic spirit, the birth of nihilism, we think of Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is the announcer of the death of God. Nietzsche, the one who, wanted to pulverize any sense of meaning or purpose within the world. Now, Nietzsche believed that there was only one thinker in the world at that time who was also speaking at the same level that he was, and that was Dostoevsky. He believed that Dostoevsky was a great psychologist as well. Now, of course, Dostoevsky was Christian and had a deep belief in redemption, the mercy of God, of grace. And so this was in a way the antithesis, the foil for Nietzsche, and he struggled with it throughout his life. And so shortly after Crime and Punishment, for instance, right? So if we've read Crime and Punishment, this is the story of an axe murderer who goes through a redemptive act throughout the course of the novel. Nietzsche really struggled with this story, and it troubled him. Now, there's one very powerful passage within Crime and Punishment, and it's a dream that the protagonist, Raskolnikov, has. And it is of a horse being beaten to death, being butchered, just being slaughtered in a town square by a drunk man. And this very startling passage, if you've read it, soul-wrenching. And the deep agony of the protagonist experiencing this within the dream is startling. And it's pages and pages, and it's bloody, and it's gruesome, and it's horrible, and it seems to touch on something deep in the soul. And the beauty of this horse, and its horrible ending, and the desire of the protagonist to protect it is startling. And it was clearly startling on Nietzsche. So everybody knows, I think, who has some knowledge of Nietzsche's life, that he died, and he died in an insane asylum. I think the common interpretation is he died from syphilis. But fewer people know about the moment that sent him to the insane asylum. And so in 1889, in Turin, at the Piazza Carlo Alberto, Nietzsche was taking a walk. Now, he'd been sick for most of his life, so he's getting some fresh air, and he's walking through the square, and something amazing happened. He saw a horse being beaten to death across the square. It's almost the same exact image from Crime and Punishment, this poor horse being beaten to death with sticks in the courtyard. And Nietzsche, the man who believed in no deeper purpose, who was beyond good and evil, who thought that there was no nobility in the world, right? Despite himself. And just a year or two after having read Crime and Punishment, rushed across a square, threw his body over the horse to save it from being beaten, and took blows. And after that moment, he was insane. That was his last rational moment. And if you ask me, Nietzsche ended well. I mean, for all of his darkness, for all of the great harm that he did to philosophy and thought within the West, that was a noble end. And I think that was a hopeful end. And I think that you see the power of grace and the power of beauty even on the very darkest and troubled of souls. So that's a dramatic way for me to end tonight. But thank you very much. I don't actually know how long I went, but I think I more than used up my time. I appreciate your patience with me, and thank you for letting me share some of my thoughts with you this evening. So.